Hello everyone! In this lesson we will learn how to associate an image with a post. In WordPress this is referred to as a featured image. Let's dive right into the action. In this case I want to associate an image with each professor. So if I click on Programs up in the header and then click on Biology, I can click on Dr. Barks-a-Lot under the Biology Professors. Okay, and now that I'm on a professor page, I can use this link up in the header menu bar, Edit Professor. And I said I want to associate an image with this professor, so sometimes your first instinct might just be to use the Add Media button to add a photograph into the main content box. However, in this case, that's not what we want. We don't want to edit the content. Instead, we want to programmatically assign a one-on-one relationship between this post and an image. Now, depending on which WordPress themes you've used in the past, you might be familiar with a box that usually sits right about here named Featured Image or Post Thumbnail. So our goal for this lesson is to enable that feature. By default, themes do not support featured images. In order to enable featured images, let's jump into our text editor, and in our theme folder, I want you to open up functions.php. Now, in a previous lesson, we already created a function named University Features, and within this function, this is where we can tell WordPress what sort of features we want our theme to support. So right below this Add Theme Support line, let's just add a new line and call Add Theme Support again. And this time, let's give it an argument of post-thumbnails. In WordPress, featured images are also sometimes referred to as post thumbnails. Okay, let's go ahead and save this. Now, that alone will still not enable featured images for our professor post type. The code we just wrote will indeed enable featured images for blog posts, but when it comes to custom post types, we have to go the extra mile or extra kilometer. So for the next step, we can temporarily forget about the theme folder, and instead I want you to jump into our MU or must use plugins folder. So within this file where we register our different post types, let's scroll down to the bottom for the professor post type, and let's focus on this supports parameter, and within the array for that, let's add on a comma and add on thumbnail. Not post thumbnail, just simply thumbnail. Okay, now let's save that. Perfect. There we have it. Let's go ahead and test this out. So set featured image. Let's select a file to upload. I've already got a JPEG on my computer named Barks-a-Lot. You're obviously free to use any photographs that you want to use from your computer. If you do want to follow along and use the same images as me, you should be able to find these photos in the attached resources for this lesson. So I will select this photo of a dog. That's weird, it closed out the lightbox without selecting it. That might just be an issue because we are using our proxy preview server instead of just actually visiting fictionaluniversity.dev up in the address bar. But I'm thinking I can just click Set Featured Image again, and instead of re-uploading the image, just click Media Library to see your existing images. Just go ahead and click on it, and then in the bottom right corner, Set Featured Image. Cool, there it is. Let's go ahead and update this or save the post. And while we're at it, why don't we edit the other professor that was named Meowsalot. So I'm going to click on professors to view a list of them. Here's Dr. Meowsalot. Before we add an image, why don't we also say that Meowsalot teaches biology? So add that as a program. Cool. And then let's set a featured image for Meowsalot. So upload files, select a file. I'm going to use this photo of a cat. You're free to follow along or use your own image. In the bottom right, click Set Featured Image. Cool, there we have it. Let's update or save that post. And the logical question now is, how do we actually use that image on the front end of our website? So if I use this permalink to view the individual screen for Dr. Meowsalot, you could imagine that we would want to output that image right about here. So let's do that right now. This screen is being powered by single-professor. So back in our text editor, we can forget about the MU plugins folder for now. Let's switch back to our theme folder, and let's jump into single-professor.php. Down here we see a class of container, and within it we see a div with a class of generic content. And this block of PHP is what's responsible for outputting this text here, the main content. So right before the content, why don't we output the featured image? We can just say the post thumbnail, and it's a function, semicolon, and this function will create an HTML image element and pull in the featured image source. So let's save that. Cool, there's the image. I think it would look better though if the image maybe only took up 1/3 of the width, and then the text sat side by side and took up 2/3 of the width. Right, so just a typical 2-column layout. So to achieve that in our code, why don't we actually delete this entire block of PHP here with the post thumbnail and the content so we can get a fresh start. Okay, so now we've just got this empty generic content div, and within it, let's drop down to a new line. And let's create a new div with a class of row and group and include a closing tag. And then within that brand new div, let's create one div that has a class of 1/3 and close out that div. And this is where the featured image will live. We will add that in just a second. You can add spacing around the divs if that helps you stay organized. But right below this div, let's create another div with a class of 2/3. Close it out. And this is where the content will live. So now we've got this 2-column layout, first column, second column. Within the first column, let's output the featured image. So the function is the post thumbnail. And then within the second column, let's output the main content. So PHP, the content. Let's give that a save. Cool, I think that looks a lot better. And now that we've added the featured image to this professor profile screen, let's go back to a program post. So for example, if I click onto the biology program, down in the related professors area, instead of just a boring plain text list, I think it would be nice if we pulled in the featured image for each professor and then overlaid a transparent bit of text with their name on top of the image. So let's go ahead and set that up right now. The theme file that controls this screen is single-program. Let's scroll down a bit until we see the related professor's custom query. And right below that, in this while loop, that's where we control the HTML that gets output once for each professor. Now before we output the image here, I first want to add a few CSS classes to these elements to get the styling just right. So on this list item, let's give it a class of professor card __ list item. And then right after the closing list item tag and right before the opening A tag, let's drop down to a new line just to stay organized. And we can also drop down at the end of the A tag line. In terms of the contents of the A element, let's actually delete that. And in between the opening and closing tags, let's drop down to a new line. On this opening A tag, we can keep the href and the permalink, but right before that, let's go ahead and give this element a class of professor card. Okay, and then within the A tag, I want to create two new elements. One is the image of the professor, and the other is a span with their name that will be overlapped or overlaid on top of the image. So first let's create an image, and then right below that let's create a span tag. To get the styling right, let's give the image a class of professor card __ image, and let's give this span a class of professor card __ name. Okay, now within the span, we just want to output the title, right? That's the professor's name. So go into PHP and call the title. And then on this image element, let's just give it a source attribute that points towards the URL of the featured image. So to do that, we're going to need to drop into PHP, and let's call a function named the post thumbnail URL. And that's a function, so give it its own set of parentheses. Okay, and before we save this, if we are creating multiple list item elements, we probably want them to all live within a single UL or unordered list element. So right before this while loop begins, up here, let's echo out an unordered list element, just the opening tag, and let's give it a class of Professor Cards, as in plural, semicolon at the end of that line. And then right when our list item element closes, see how we have this one curly bracket that closes out the while loop? Let's go right underneath that line, but notice not underneath this if statement curly bracket. So in between the two curly brackets, let's just echo out a closing unordered list tag, and be sure to add a semicolon at the end. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. Perfect. We see Dr. Barks a lot and Dr. Meows a lot. There's a nice little hover effect, and if you click on one of them, we're taken to their detail screen. Okay, now at this point, let's change gears a bit and talk about the size of the image. So for example, if I right-click on the image and choose Open Image in New Tab, in that new tab, you can see that the image is almost 5,000 pixels wide by 3,000 pixels tall. Right? There's the full resolution. Now that is way too large. We are not going to display the image full screen, so there's no reason to force the visitors of our website to download an image that's that huge. Right? That's just going to waste their data plan or their bandwidth. Also, when it comes to the size of this image, you could imagine that on the Professor detail screen, we might want the image to be taller than it is wide. Right? Maybe portrait instead of landscape. So portrait on this screen, but then back on the program page, in this instance, we're happy with the images being in landscape, wider than they are tall. Now before we get into the code that controls the size of images, I first want to show you something. Right now, I want you to open up the folder or directory where your WordPress site lives. So in my case, that's local sites, fictional university, and then app. And then I want you to go into the WP content folder, and let's go into a folder that we have not inspected until this very moment, a folder named Uploads. By default, WordPress keeps things organized by year and then month. Okay, but the reason I'm showing you this folder is to point out that by default, you'll notice there's 5 copies of each image that we've uploaded. So for example, when it comes to Barks a lot, here's the original high resolution, very large copy of the photo. But then WordPress automatically generates all of these different sized copies. So here's one that's about 1,000 pixels wide, about 800 pixels wide, 300, and finally a tiny 150 by 150 that's cropped to be a perfect square. So we've got the original image, and then WordPress automatically generates 4 resized copies. But luckily, in our theme, we can tell WordPress to automatically generate another copy of the image that is any size that we want. So check this out. Back in our text editor, let's jump into our functions.php file. And within our function that is named University Features, right below this Add Theme Support Post Thumbnails line, let's add a new line and call a function named Add Image Size. So for example, first let's create an image size that is the perfect landscape aspect ratio for a professor photo. So in this case, the photo does not need to be very large at all, right? So within our add image size function, we need to pass it several arguments. The first argument is a nickname for this image size. We can name this whatever we want, but just to make sense, why don't we call it Professor Landscape? You could call it Pizza or Unicorn. And then the next argument is how many pixels wide the image should be. Let's say 400. The next argument is how many pixels tall the image should be. Why don't we say 260? And the final argument is if you want to crop the image or not. So by default, this is set to false. And what that will do is just constrain the image to either the maximum width or height that you've defined. However, if we want the image to be exactly this wide and exactly this tall, well, the only way to really enforce that is if you crop the image. So if you're willing to crop the image, you can set this to true. And by default, WordPress will crop in towards the very center of the photograph. We will learn more about cropping in just a moment, but for now we've successfully created a new image size. Let's go ahead and create another size for Professor Portrait, right? Because back on a Professor Detail screen, maybe we want the image to be taller than it is wide. So back in our code, let's just call the add image size function again. Let's give this size a nickname of Professor Portrait. How wide should it be? Let's say 480. How tall should it be? Let's say 650. I'm just making these numbers up, by the way. And let's say that it also is allowed to crop to match those sizes perfectly. Okay, now if we save this and then jump back to our uploads folder, you'll notice that there's still only 5 copies of each image. And that's because WordPress will use these rules or new sizes for future images that we upload, but WordPress isn't going to go back and retroactively create the new sizes for these images that we've already uploaded. So let me show you a quick example. If I go into my admin dashboard and maybe create a brand new professor, so add new professor, let's name this professor Dr. Froggerson. Let's add a bit of dummy text for the content. Let's say that Dr. Froggerson teaches math, but most importantly, if we give him an image, set featured image, and upload a new file of a frog, you can find this image in the resources for this lesson. There it is. Let's go ahead and click set featured image down in the bottom right. Here we see the frog. Let's go ahead and publish or save this new post. Okay, now back to the topic at hand. If we go back to our uploads folder, you'll see that there are 7 copies of that new frog image. So here's the original high resolution. These are the 4 copies that WordPress creates by default, but most importantly, here we see the 400 by 260 and the 480 by 650, right? These are the custom portrait and landscape sizes that we just created. Now at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, that's cool, but it's kind of frustrating that WordPress won't retroactively create the new sizes for these old images. Well, you're not alone in thinking that. Millions of other people have had that same thought, and luckily there's a plugin that will retroactively create the new sizes for us. So check this out. In the sidebar, let's hover over plugins and click add new. Let's use this field to search for a plugin that is named Regenerate Thumbnails. And here's the plugin that I'm looking for. You'll know it's the right one if it has over 1 million active installs. So let's go ahead and install this. If you see a failed message here, that's just because WordPress can't always trust our preview proxy server, right? So instead of the preview proxy server URL that our gulp watch task spins up for us, in order to install and activate a new plugin, I'm just going to go to fictionaluniversity.dev. Okay, and then let's activate that new plugin that we just installed. Perfect. And now if we hover over the Tools item towards the bottom of our sidebar, we see this new option named Regen Thumbnails. And once we click it, we're taken to this screen, and now we can just click this button down here, and WordPress will automatically, retroactively create the new sizes for all of our previously uploaded images. Now this process might take a few minutes depending on the speed of your computer, but once it completes, if we jump back to our uploads folder, you'll see that WordPress created the new 2 sizes of portrait and landscape for our original cat photo and dog photo. Cool, so at this point now the question becomes, how do we actually use those custom resized images on the front end of our website? And that is the exact question that we are going to answer in our next lesson. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.